The surface of Lake Minnesota was hauntingly still that evening, but inside this dining room a storm was brewing, ready to sweep my entire life away. My father slammed his hand onto the table, making the crystal glasses rattle violently. He growled every word, feeling like a jagged blade. "You are quitting your job in the city immediately and moving back here. Kendra is exhausted from taking care of the baby, and you, as her sister, have a responsibility to carry her weight. This isn't a request. It's an order." My mother sat beside him, feigning a wipe of her tears as she added, "Just look at your sister. She has sacrificed so much already. This house has no room for a selfish child who only cares about her career." I didn't cry, nor did I bother to argue. Instead, I cast a fleeting glance at the leather briefcase sitting right by the leg of my chair, the one thing in this room that no one else knew existed. Inside was the result of a financial investigation I had been secretly conducting for the past 3 weeks. When my father leaned forward, declaring a chilling ultimatum, "If you leave, I'll disinherit you, and you won't get a single cent from this lakeside villa." I simply smiled. It was a smile that made the whole family freeze. They thought they were using this estate to shackle me, but they had no idea that the inheritance they were so proudly wielding was actually a massive debt bomb about to explode, and I was the only one holding the detonator. The story is just beginning, and the truth hidden inside the briefcase at my feet is far more terrifying than they can imagine. If you want to see how I'll make them pay for their greed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the shocking showdown coming up next. The first time they used my name to secure a loan, I genuinely believed it was a clerical error, a simple oversight in my father's messy paperwork. I was wrong. It wasn't a mistake. It was the opening move in a calculated campaign to erode my life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a shell for them to inhabit. I remember that autumn 3 years ago vividly. My father, Vincent, called me into his study at the lake house, smelling of cedarwood and stale tobacco. He handed me a stack of documents for a supposed community landscape renovation project he claimed to be consulting on. He looked me straight in the eye, his voice thick with unearned pride, and asked me to sign as a technical guarantor. I trusted him because he was the man who taught me how to read a compass. 2 months later, I discovered that my signature hadn't guaranteed a public park. It had secured a $65,000 high-interest loan for a luxury SUV that my sister Kendra was currently flaunting across her social media. When I confronted them, my mother Phyllis simply patted my hand and said, "Kendra needs to maintain an image for her business, Lydia. You have a steady salary, you don't understand the pressure she's under." They didn't apologize. They just expected me to absorb the risk as if it were my birthright to suffer for Kendra's vanity. The second betrayal was even more surgical. Last spring, Kendra's husband Brett approached me with a family investment opportunity in a new residential development. I declined, citing my focus on my own firm. Little did I know Brett had already accessed my personal professional credentials from the files I kept in my old bedroom. He forged my signature on a partnership agreement using my hard-earned reputation as an architect to lure in private investors for a cryptocurrency-backed real estate scheme. By the time I found out my professional liability insurance was already on the line, they were gambling with my career using my name as their personal collateral while I was working 16-hour days in Minneapolis to build something of my own. What they didn't realize, what they never cared to ask, was that my little gardening business, as Vincent so dismissively called it, had just struck gold. 6 months ago, I finalized a massive deal with the Sterling Grove Resort Group. I had designed their flagship coastal property, a project that didn't just win awards. It came with a 7-figure payout and a recurring royalty structure that effectively secured my financial future for the next decade. My bank account now held more liquidity than all of Vincent's properties combined. I had the means to buy and sell every person at that dinner table twice over, but I kept it all hidden behind a veil of exhaustion and modest clothes. I let them believe I was still the struggling, dutiful daughter they could bully into submission. Every time Phyllis complained about the rising cost of lake house maintenance while wearing a new diamond pendant, I just nodded. I was no longer their safety net. I was an architect watching their house of cards sway in the wind, waiting for the exact moment to pull the final foundation stone. They thought they were draining me dry, but in reality, I was just letting them accumulate enough debt to ensure they could never climb out of the hole they were digging. Everything began to unravel when I found a red letter tucked between my father's old newspapers, carrying the unmistakable scent of deception. I waited until the house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence before retreating to my childhood bedroom, a space that now felt like a cage rather than a sanctuary. The moonlight filtered through the pines, casting jagged shadows across the floor as I clicked open the brass latches of the leather briefcase. The sound felt like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. I pulled out the internal audit documents I had spent weeks gathering through private investigators and back-channel banking contacts, and for a moment the air left my lungs. The total debt didn't just exceed my worst fears. It shattered them. $850,000. The figure stared back at me in cold, uncompromising ink. It wasn't just a number. It was an execution order for my future. As I flipped through the secondary ledger, I found the true source of the rot. Brett, my sister's husband, hadn't just been investing family money. He had been operating a shadow real estate scheme, flipping properties with high-interest bridge loans that were all secured using my professional identity. There it was, my signature forged with a terrifying, practiced precision on over a dozen illegal development contracts across the state. My hands didn't shake. They went numb. In the eyes of the law, I wasn't the victim. I was the mastermind. If the federal authorities or the banking commission launched an investigation into these unauthorized transactions, I wouldn't just lose my bank accounts. I would be facing a decade in a federal penitentiary for financial fraud and racketeering. Brett had effectively tied a noose around my neck to fund his delusions of being a real estate mogul. He had used my hard-earned architectural license as a shield for his crimes, knowing that if the house of cards fell, I would be the one buried under the rubble. The sheer scale of the betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest, a crushing pressure that threatened to break me. The shock that had initially paralyzed me evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, bone-deep coldness. I realized then that the people sleeping down the hall, the parents who enabled this, and the sister who benefited from every stolen cent, weren't my family anymore. They were liabilities. They were the architects of my potential destruction, and they were still expecting me to smile and play the role of the submissive, helpful daughter while they tightened the rope. Every hug from Phyllis, every patronizing lecture from Vincent, and every boastful remark from Kendra now felt like a calculated move in a game I hadn't realized I was playing. This was no longer a domestic dispute over inheritance or career choices. This was a war for my very existence. The realization sharpened my focus into a singular, lethal point of intent. I didn't need to scream, and I didn't need to cry. I needed to move with the surgical precision of a predator. Every dollar I had made from the resort group, every legal connection I had fostered, and every ounce of my intellect would now be weaponized. I stared at the forged signatures until the sun began to peek over the horizon, my mind already drafting a counteroffensive that would leave no room for survivors. This was no longer a family matter. It was a legal fight for survival, and I intended to win at any cost. Instead of screaming at the ceiling, I chose to call the one man my father had spent a lifetime avoiding, my personal attorney, Mr. Sterling. While the rest of the house slept in a cocoon of unearned security, I was parked in a dimly lit corner of a 24-hour diner 3 towns over, staring at a digital contract on my laptop. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a rhythmic red glow over the documents that would soon dismantle Vincent's legacy. Sterling's voice on the other end of the line was crisp, devoid of the sentimental rot that had poisoned my family. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a strategy that was as cold and structural as the skyscrapers I designed for a living. The financial reality was grim, but it presented a unique lethal opportunity. Because Brett's fraudulent real estate ventures had defaulted so spectacularly, the primary bank had already classified the mortgage on the lake house as a non-performing loan. To the bank, my family's home was just a liability they wanted off their balance sheet at any cost. Under Sterling's guidance, I didn't reach out to the bank as a daughter trying to save her parents. I reached out as the anonymous managing member of Emerald Vista LLC, a shell company I had established months ago to handle my architectural royalties. We offered to buy the debt in its entirety for 60 cents on the dollar. It was a cold, hard cash transaction that the bank accepted within 48 hours. My family expected me to use my savings to pay off the arrears and restore their credit, essentially flushing my hard-earned money down the drain of their incompetence. They truly believed I would sacrifice my future to preserve their comfort. They were wrong. I wasn't paying their debt. I was purchasing it. By acquiring the note through my LLC, I effectively stepped into the shoes of the bank. I was no longer the little girl they could manipulate with guilt-tripping stories about family loyalty. I was now their primary creditor. I held the legal right to dictate the terms of their residency, the right to charge interest, and most importantly, the absolute right to initiate foreclosure if a single payment was missed, which, given Brett's current bankruptcy, was a mathematical certainty. "Are you sure about this, Lydia?" Sterling had asked, his voice momentarily softening. "Once we execute the transfer of the lien, there's no going back to being just a daughter." I didn't hesitate for a single second. I watched a group of teenagers laughing in a booth across the diner, oblivious to the fact that I was currently signing a death warrant for my relationship with my parents. I thought about the forged signatures the SUV Kendra was driving, and the way Vincent had looked at me as if I were a servant who had forgotten her place. The sentimentality in my heart had been cauterized long ago. I clicked the final digital signature, the soft sound of the submit button, feeling more satisfying than any professional accolade I had ever received. I wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. I was the architect of a reckoning. I didn't buy back the house to rescue them from their own greed or to provide a roof for Kendra's lies. I bought the rights to ensure they would eventually lose it all through a process they couldn't argue with the law. I didn't buy the house to save them. I bought the right to make them lose it legally, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, it would be my hand holding it. The fragile illusion of peace at the lake house shattered on a humid Tuesday morning when two black SUVs pulled into the gravel driveway. I was standing in the kitchen watching the steam rise from my coffee when the heavy thud of a fist against the front door echoed through the hallway. Vincent stumbled out of his bedroom, still in his silk robe, looking disoriented and frail, until he saw the badges. These weren't the local deputies. They were recovery agents and legal representatives from the primary financial institution, flanked by a court-appointed server. They weren't there for a friendly chat. They were there to deliver a formal notice of foreclosure and an immediate demand for the $850,000 that Brett had flushed away. Kendra rushed down the stairs, clutching her infant and sobbing about the unfairness of it all, while Brett slunk into the shadows of the living room like a cornered rat. The lead representative, a man with a face as hard as granite, stepped into the foyer and unfurled a stack of documents. "Mr. Vincent, the grace period has expired," he stated, his voice echoing with a cold, bureaucratic finality. "Every signature on these defaulted bridge loans points back to this estate and your family's architectural credentials. Unless you can produce the full balance today, we are initiating the seizure of this property." What happened next was a masterclass in human depravity. Instead of taking a stand, instead of protecting the daughter he had spent years belittling, Vincent straightened his back and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even look me in the eye. "It's not us you want," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic urgency. "You need to talk to Lydia. Every single one of those loans, the management of the accounts, The spending, it was all her. We are just elderly parents who trusted our professional daughter. She manipulated our signatures and used our legacy as her personal piggy bank. She's the one who spent the money. We're just the victims of her greed. The room went deathly silent. I felt Phyllis's hand tighten on my arm, but it wasn't for comfort. It was a silent plea for me to accept the blow, to be the martyr one last time. Kendra looked at me with a sickening glint of hope, ready to watch me burn if it meant she could keep her SUV and her vanity. Even the bank representative looked stunned by the sheer cowardice of a father throwing his own flesh and blood to the wolves to save a house he didn't even own anymore. Vincent continued his frantic lies, claiming I had stolen the family's credit to fund my life in Minneapolis, painting me as a financial predator who had preyed on her own kin. I stood there paralyzed, not by fear, but by a profound sense of clarity. The last flickering ember of love I held for the man who raised me was snuffed out in an instant, replaced by a cold obsidian void. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an attempted execution of my character and my freedom. He wasn't just letting me take the fall. He was actively trying to send me to prison to cover for his favored child's husband. The overlap of treachery upon treachery felt like a physical weight crushing the final remnants of my hesitation. I watched his mouth move, heard the venomous lies pouring out, and I felt nothing but a quiet, lethal resolve. He thought he was sacrificing a pawn to save his king, but he was actually handing a weapon to the person who now held his entire world in her hands. The time for architectural planning was over. The time for the demolition had arrived. The front door had barely clicked shut behind the bank representatives when the atmosphere in the living room turned predatory. Vincent didn't waste a second. He shoved a crumpled legal pad and a pen toward me, his face a mask of desperate authority. "You heard the man, Lydia. If you don't sign a confession stating you managed those accounts without our knowledge, Brett goes to prison and we lose the house. You're young. You're an architect, you can recover. We can't. Sign it, or you're no longer a daughter of this family." Kendra stood behind him, nodding frantically, her eyes devoid of anything but self-preservation. They weren't asking for help. They were demanding I commit social and professional suicide to shield their precious Brett. I looked at the pen then, up at my father, and I felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. I reached into my bag, but I didn't take the pen. Instead, I pulled out a thick, blue-bound folder, the forensic handwriting analysis I had commissioned weeks ago. I slid it across the mahogany table with a quiet thud. "Before we discuss my signature, perhaps we should discuss yours, Brett." I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. Brett's face, already pale, turned a sickly shade of gray. As Vincent began to sputter in confusion, I opened the report to the final page, where the expert had highlighted 42 points of discrepancy between my actual signature and the forgeries Brett had used to secure those $850,000 in loans. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Brett looked at the floor, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them in his pockets. I didn't stop there. I reached back into my bag and pulled out the notarized debt assignment agreement. "You've spent the morning blaming me for your ruin, Dad," I said, looking directly at Vincent, whose eyes were darting between the forgery report and me. "But there's a detail you missed. The primary bank didn't just come here to seize the house. They came to inform you that your debt had been sold to a private entity. That entity is Emerald Vista LLC. The confusion on their faces was almost comical. Phyllis whispered, "What does that have to do with anything?" I leaned forward, my gaze as sharp as a scalpel. "I am the sole owner of Emerald Vista LLC. I used the royalties from my Sterling Grove project to buy your defaulted mortgage. I didn't do it to save you. I did it because under the original contract that you, Vincent, signed with the bank, the owner of the debt has the absolute right to initiate immediate eviction in the case of fraud or non-payment." I watched as the realization finally dawned on them. The daughter they had tried to throw to the wolves was now the one who owned the forest. You bought our house? Vincent stammered, his voice losing its thunder and shrinking into a pathetic whimper. I shook my head slowly. No, I bought the right to take it away from you. Legally. Irrevocably. I stood up, smoothing out my blazer, looking at the people who had spent my entire life trying to hollow me out. Brett was now sweating profusely, realizing that my forensic report was enough to send him to federal prison, while Vincent was literally trembling, his hands grasping at the air, as if trying to hold onto the walls of the home he had just lost. I looked at Kendra, whose mouth was hanging open in a silent scream of disbelief. According to the foreclosure notice I just authorized as your new creditor, I stated, my voice echoing through the house they no longer owned. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate this property. If anyone tries to remove so much as a light fixture, I will file additional criminal charges for theft and destruction of collateral. I walked toward the door, leaving them standing in the ruins of their greed. For the first time in 28 years, the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. I wasn't just the child they had ignored. I was the owner who was finally showing them the exit. 4 weeks after the sheriff's department oversaw the final removal of their belongings from the lake house, the silence in my Minneapolis office was interrupted by a frantic call from the lobby. The receptionist's voice was hesitant as she informed me that a group of people was causing a scene, demanding to speak with the owner of Emerald Vista. I walked to the glass mezzanine and looked down. There they were, Vincent, Phyllis, Kendra, and Brett. They looked unrecognizable. The designer clothes and the aura of unearned arrogance had vanished, replaced by the haggard, desperate look of people who had finally hit the concrete floor of reality. I didn't go down. I didn't need to hear their rehearsed apologies or their new set of excuses. I watched as the security guards firmly guided them toward the exit. Vincent looked up for a fleeting second, his eyes searching the glass windows, but I stepped back into the shadows. He had spent his life choosing the wrong daughter to protect. Now he had to live with the consequences of that blindness. My lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had already informed me of their new situation. Because their credit scores had been decimated by the foreclosure and Brett's fraudulent history, no reputable landlord would touch them. Kendra and Brett had been forced to move into a cramped, rusted trailer in a park 2 hours north, while my parents were living in a bleak, one-bedroom, subsidized apartment, surviving on meager Social Security checks that barely covered their medication. The total extinction of their former life was not a result of my cruelty, but the natural outcome of their own choices. Vincent and Phyllis had lost every cent of their life savings trying to fuel Kendra's delusions and cover Brett's crimes. By enabling the predator in their midst, they had effectively devoured their own future. Kendra, who once lived for social media praise, was now facing the harsh reality of a life without a safety net, her vanity replaced by the grueling struggle of actual poverty. Brett was still under investigation, his name now synonymous with financial ruin in every bank across the state. They were no longer a family. They were a group of strangers bound together by shared resentment and the cold weight of regret. As I sat back at my desk looking out over the skyline I helped design, I reflected on the grueling journey that had led me here. For years, I believed that love meant silence, that being a good daughter meant allowing myself to be hollowed out to fill the gaps in their lives. I was wrong. True strength isn't about how much you can endure. It's about knowing when to stop the cycle of abuse. Protecting your personal boundaries isn't an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival. If you do not define your own value, the world, even those who share your blood, will treat you as nothing more than a resource to be exhausted. I eventually sold the lake house. I didn't want the memories or the hauntings of a childhood spent in the shadow of favoritism. I used the proceeds to fund a scholarship for young architects from struggling backgrounds, ensuring that my legacy would be built on merit, not manipulation. For the first time in my 28 years, I am no longer the spare child or the dutiful servant waiting for a scrap of validation. I am the sole architect of my own destiny, holding the keys to a life built on truth and self-respect. This absolute freedom came at a devastating cost, the loss of the people who were supposed to love me most. But as I breathe in the quiet air of my new beginning, I know it was worth every single cent.